you've not only thought a lot about your years in government and in the private sector, but you've taken the time to write down your feelings, your thoughts, what you've learned, and you've kind of codified them into 6 big lessons. And I'm going to read each one and ask you to comment on them. Number 1, and you've mentioned this before in this interview, doing the right thing is often not in your best interest, but you have to do it anyway. When doing the right thing is not a threat to your personal interests, it's not a true test of character, and the choice can pass without a thought. The true test comes when you have something to lose, and you'll know it.
You know, when I warn you ahead of time, when you get into this kind of language, it sounds like pious platitudes and
Reverend Zarb.
And glib phrases. I can't be more serious and hoping that young people particularly listen to this.
Right.
I'll take it away from me personally and give you another example of my seeing it in action. In 1975, President Ford had me and a team work on an energy policy legislation, very comprehensive, and we sent it up to the Hill. It had the impact of raising prices of fuel to the people. It had the impact of increasing nuclear power. It had the impact of making the automobile industry provide more miles per gallon. And at the time I said to the president, Mr. President, we've managed to upset both the Republicans and the Democrats. I used different language, but that's what I said. And he said to me, a smile, he said, that means we have it just right. Now keep in mind, here's a man from Michigan who pardons Richard Nixon. Yeah. He's going to be running for re-election or election in 18 months. He puts together legislation that's going to raise the price of gasoline to put in your car. And he knew it was going to hurt him in the election, but he knew it was the right thing for the country. I can't think of a starker example of that happening.
Your second lesson learned is this: an important cause of individual and institutional failure is hubris. The more successful you are, the higher the risk and the greater the need for honest reassessment.
There's absolutely no question but what the biggest single factor that brings down successful people, CEOs, politicians, is their success gets to a point where they're insulated from the real world, and all the people around them are kissing their ring on a continuing basis and telling them how great they are. They get to the point where they really believe that they're one step above mortal, you and me. They could do things and take chances, take risks that we can't do, and they would not have done much earlier in their career. Elliot Spitzer's a great example of that. But there are endless examples that I've seen in my career. I've seen it bring down companies. Kodak was the name in photography when all the time I was growing up. Nobody could touch it. It was so great that internally it never worked to innovate itself. So when digital cameras came along, it was killed. And so it's institutional hubris. There's also, in my view, a national hubris where a country can get so cocksure of itself and think it's so much greater than the rest of the universe that it elects stupid leaders and does stupid things.
Well, why didn't it affect you? You were really successful in not just one little field, but a number of fields in the private sector and the public sector. I mean, not to throw you a softball or not to make you blush, but why didn't you fall to hubris?
Well, probably 2 reasons. Earlier in life, I couldn't believe I was so fortunate to be in this step. I just didn't believe that me, with my background, is there and should be there. So it was self-questioning. Later in life, I saw too many examples of great men falling because of hubris. So I learned, hopefully learned from their mistake, and tried everything I could to avoid it. But my early beginnings probably contributed to it, my humble beginnings.
Third lesson learned: when you do not pay attention to the unthinkable, the worst case scenario, you can pay an unthinkably high price. Best and worst recent example, the avoidable financial crisis of 2008.
One of my favorites, and one of the principles in my course is titled, "It's the Model, Stupid." And the point I try and make is that when you're running a company and you ask your staff to run a model on a step, and they give you worst case, best case,
right,
you'll never get the real worst case, because they won't imagine what could be worse than what's happened before. So they'll go back and look at the worst event in the past, and that's their worst case. The fact is, they should be looking at events that were not contemplated, they never thought it was possible, but if it did happen. In the 2008 question, it's exactly what happened. In all of my lifetime, real estate went up. It was the safest investment for individuals, for corporations. It just never, it had blips, but it never went down. It was retained its value forever. The models that people worked with didn't reflect what would happen if real estate values went to 50% of current. So the example here in real terms is that when you're CEO of a company, send the staff back and say, this is not the worst case. Give me the real worst case. You do that and you'll begin to see what really could happen. And maybe you won't jump to a different conclusion, but you might put in some contingencies.
Right. And the best example in your case where people came back with an unthinkable situation that you had to felt you had to respond to?
I think at NASDAQ, NASDAQ hit 5,000. My people had concluded that this is, as I've said before, the worst three words. It's different this time. And I knew in my heart of hearts it wasn't different this time. It was going to be, the bubble was going to burst. So I sent them back for that. Now, the answer to that was convince the public to be careful. Unfortunately, that doesn't work out.
Would you consider that one of your failures of
Sure.
not being able, of feeling more like a Chicken Little?
I second guess myself all the time. Should I have made a speech saying the market's going to crash and you're all going to lose money? Well, if the next day the market did crash and they did lose money, the speech would have been blamed. So, but I'm not sure of that. And I still question whether I should not have done that.
Yeah, yeah. Lesson learned number 4. National crises provide an opportunity for good and bad public policy. Collective fear can help force bipartisan effort. They also create an opportunity to slip in ideological measures which have nothing to do with the crises.
All those things are almost always true. A crisis, the energy crisis, Democrats and Republicans, during the crisis itself, gave me everything I needed and some things I didn't need. They, for example, forced me to buy ration stamps. And our analysis showed that this economy, this society, at this point, ration stamps were just dumb. But I had to buy them, right. Ultimately burned them some years later. But when then the legislation goes up to respond long term, and you get energy people putting in provisions that would increase their revenues. You get environmentalists putting in that have nothing to do with energy going forward. Those are simple examples. In 2008, Sarbanes-Oxley, the financial services legislation, the stuff in that legislation had nothing to do with the financial crisis.
Right. People were stuffing the stocking while they had the public's attention.
So that you have two things. The good thing is that you really do get serious attention. The energy crisis, trouble is, once the embargo was over, that interest went away, but during that period of time you have it. The bad thing is people slip in stuff that has no merit and long term is probably damaging.
Lesson learned number 5. Effective negotiation demands a deep understanding of the other side. Building trust comes easier if you can form a human connection with the other party.
That's always true. And I'll give you just two examples. In government, when I had a tough oversight chairman in the Democratic House, John Dingell, he was a tough, tough adversary. And some events occurred where we had a showdown. But after that, we began to know each other and know what our problems were.
Lesson learned number 6, and last. When you become the CEO for your company, the most important thing you can do is to put people around you who are capable of taking your job.
Now nothing could be truer. It does two things for the company. First, it makes your life easier as CEO because you have real competent people running their area, and as a result, you don't have to spend as much time worrying about their area. You have to provide oversight and leadership, but you're comfortable with what they do, they're doing well. Secondly, you don't have to worry about succession. Now, the complicating part of that is if you have 3 people who are in charge of different parts of the business, every one of them qualified to take your job. At the end of the day, you appoint one of them, the other 2 might go because they were passed over.
Right.
That's true, and but still a small price to pay for putting good people around you.